How's it going, everyone? Welcome. Eulier Gonzalez here. So, in today's videos and in the next series of videos for the next week, I want to look at the entire rendering logic model 2 made by a software engineer that previously worked at Khan Academy, and he went and developed this React application at scale, and then later on he went through Gatsby, called, sorry about that, Jesus, oh my god, Josh Camila, right? So in the past videos, I went through describe the history of how do we get here very quickly, and that is, hey, first we need to understand what CSS is. And in the last video, I described the story of how now CSS, HTML, JavaScript, the web IDL, which is now what are the interface that web platforms needs to implement so we can have access to, for example, common things like parsing numeric values or adding variables to the global environment, and how also relate to HTTP, the TCP/IP, and the blockchain and Bitcoin, right? So that was quite interesting, but I want to make a quick recap of how do I get here to explore now this layout mode, the positioning layout, because just to again and a very quick recap of this. So CSS allow is to style documents, HTML documents, all right, or these hypertext markup documents. So this is hypertext because if you can think of when you are reading, or I don't know, well, actually right now we are in an era that we barely know what physical paper is, right? But for example, the Bible or any of this biblical content, when you have to read the content passing physical pages, all right, the only content that you can do or show is text, right? So this hypertext is you can not only read text, but also is play videos, look at image, and play audio. And this is now open up a new gateway drugs of content, right? That you can see, so you can see things like Facebook, now Meta, and Instagram, TikTok, the e-commerce platforms like Shopify or even Amazon, you know, and also how you can store value like PayPal or your bank applications like that, you know. So it opens up a huge new economy, right, in which we can exchange here over these physical devices. So that's great. So because in order to style in these documents, we need to have a language, and that is CSS, and it follows a specification. That spec described is how all of these elements in this markup language, the HTML, right, they're gonna look like in visual medias like this, right, that you are currently at, right? And it say all of these elements will use now this thing called the box model. And this is the anatomy of this, right? Your content, the padding, the border, the margin, and some of the properties that you can go with, right? And when it comes to select these elements or to know the fundamentals of the CSS, which is, well, how can I apply those styles, whether it's the external resource or internal or even inline at the HTML element, right? And how can I select a particular element to apply the look and feel of this user elements, right, of this HTML. And there are several selectors, whether it's by class or by attribute or by tag or by pseudo selectors like pseudo classes, when it select now based on a particular state that that element can be. For example, and the most common one is the bottom, when you hover on that or when you focus, right? And because there is a huge list of elements, each one of them, well, they have this particularly state-based or UI state-based. So I just mentioned is the bottom because that's the most common one. And further down the line, I'm going to go with other or with the most common at the current web development in 2026. Okay, so after I know how to select those elements, how can I use some of the common functionality that CSS provide? For example, like which color can I use, or the how can I calculate, how can I run some basic arithmetic on that, among other features, right? And also, what are the behaviors that CSS allow me to do? So, for example, if I want to define now a particular look and feel of a website, I can use now a layer and define all the rules, the CSS rules that's going to apply to that. The other is that how the content is going to look like when there is a particular width in the viewport, all right? Known as a media, and you have all additional or several rules at that, right? So, and the other important thing is how the content is going to be rendered, right? So this is more like a human aspect. Western cultures most of the time read content from left to right. Some Arabic language like Farsi, they read content from right to left. And on the middle or on the West or Southeast Asia or Asia, right? So they show they read content from top to bottom, right? This is beautiful because it exposes you to all the cultures and how now they read their content, right? They consume most of their content. So not only the inline directions, but also is that how this content stack each other, or the block direction, okay? And you can also add some comment. All of this is just the fundamental of CSS. And once you understand what are the current things that are relevant in 2026, is that first you need to understand is the CSS anatomy. How is this made of? The property, the values, and there are certain selectors that are still being used despite the modern web model or the web model development, like how you select now a class, or how you can select an attributes, or how you can combine selectors, right? To actually select only the first elements, whether it's the first end of type, or the first type, or the first child, the last end of the child, or the last end of type, right? And pseudo classes based on this possible state that this HTML element can be. So for example is, well, hover, one of them. The focus on inputs as well. And also some pseudo elements that allow you to add some elements most likely for decoration purpose, like after or pseudo, like after or before, and the placeholders on inputs, right? And just mention is just the most common one, right? So the other is that color is another part of the fundamentals that we need to know as we're styling our applications and the different formats. So whether it's keyword like educational content, or RGB, X, HSL, and recently now the OLAC. Okay, the values that we can have on CSS, whether it's pixels, percentage, and root elements. When can we use that? What is the most common? The common use cases. So for alignment of elements, for design elements, use padding for that, or pixels for improving the readability of your content. You use now root M or M, right? And for anything related to inherit content from another, or from a pattern layer, you use now percentage for that, right? So again, this is the most common use case for units, and the other is for typographies. So what are the different typos we have? So sans serif and serif. And what is web font family? What is web fonts? Which is a set of characters that we can use to provide now a look and feel, or to give now a branding of this particular product, right? So Airbnb, for example, is using now cerulean fonts for that. In this set of web fonts, or this collections of fonts, we have now is label on, we have now variants, right? So whether it's regular, whether it's thin, ultra thin, regular, bold, and or the different, whether it's the font weights and the variants. The font weight is what I mentioned, and the variant is the like what this text can describe. The strong or bold is where something is important, or italic when you want to describe is something like, hey, this is what the user, what the author is thinking, or some foreign words, or some scientific terms, right? And also is what are the things that you can do with the typography. So alignments, line heights, letter spacings, and all of that is just to summarize is the fundamentals of the current state of CSS at 2026. So far so good, because now we actually can get into understand how can we build our first website, and how the web authors at the beginning of this internet era, they use is the flow layer, because it's the only layer that they have available to build this kind of applications, right? So the flow layer, or the normal flow, is the OG, and this describes how all of these different boxes are going to interact together, right? So what is relevant here, and a little bit of history before describing each topic one by one, okay, is that first we need to understand what the CSS reset is. Why do we have that? And because in the early era of the web developments, all of these different browsers they go with their own. It was a wild west where they implement all of these different documents that they like, so a designer and a bunch of designers actually create this CSS reset to say, hey, let's make all of these different HTML elements, right? Whether if this is a section or a paragraph or a heading or an input, or in the input can be is a type text or an email or password or radio checkboxes or select. We also have now range, or whether it is the this element is now an image or a video, right? So we want to have a blank state, right? A common place where no matter which browser is going to render this, they all gonna be on the same landscape, in the same state, right? This is part of the CSS resets. So because some of those CSS properties can be now passing down or can be inherited, right? The way how competing CSS declarations actually get applied to the by the browser is known as the cascade effect, right? I'm not gonna dive too much into this, but the TLDR is that it goes first to look at it goes first to understand the important keyword, all right, and then where this CSS definitions live. Is this live on the application or on the user or on the browser, right? And the further or the last place I mentioned, the less likely is for those styles to be applied, right? And then you also have the which selector you're using. Are you selecting is now an ID or a class or an HTML tag, and the other is the order matters, where this style is defined, right? But this is at the bottom because that is what is going to be applied if they have the same name, right? This is just to briefly describe what the CSS cascade is, right? And the other is the notion that I mentioned before of the direction of this content, how you're going to consume that content. And what are the properties that right now we have available, not based on the position, but based on the reading content or the reading flow, right? Whether it is an inline or a block. And because this direction is going to impact how all of these elements are going to render by the browser, all of these boxes, right? This is why I recap the box model, okay? And how these boxes are going to interact with each other, which by default is with the normal layout, the OG, right? So in this layout, you have now three type of blocks. Whether it is the block that is greedy, it takes all the available horizontal space. The inline block that it doesn't want to make any fuss, it just take only the minimum width possible. You can modify it is dimension unlike a block that you can, but it doesn't line break the content, right? But inline does. But when you want to now make that particular element behave like a block and an inline, you use now the inline block. So you can, with these elements, now modify its dimensions, right? And it's going to line break the content. So why am I mentioning this? Because this is set the stepping stone of building our own web application, right? And we also did that with a web agency website, right? Pretty simple, and how now the authors initially back in perhaps 1995, 1996, and 7, right? How they describe all of this document and how they want to look like. So that's great. But as we now look at the nuance of this layout, which is, for example, is how the margins behave and the margin collapse and the different rules that what margin collapse fell into. So that's great because with that now yeah, so with that, right? And we can look at the next layout, and you can think of this as CSS like a set of mini layouts, all right, or like a set of layouts that describe how all of these different boxes is going to behave, is going to interact with each other. So the OG is the flow layout, and you have the positioning layer, which is what we're going to look in today's video, also the flexbox, the grids, and among others. So on the positioning layer, so anytime that, because so far we have looked at how can we render its elements in a nicely orderly fashion, okay? So when do we need to, let's make a quick pause here. All right, so, and we're back, right? So as I mentioned before, everything that we have saw so far is just how all of these different boxes align to each other in a nicely orderly fashion, right? But sometimes you need this content to now sit on top of that, right? On front of it. So when that happens, well, we can now to up in that box to the positioning layer. And this can have several modes. So you have now relative, absolute, fixed, and static, or sticky here, right? So far here, I have looked at how the relative position is and what happened when you up into this mode, right? Which is two things happen. So you set some constraints to this particular element, right? And then now you have access to different or to additional properties like top, right, bottom, and left, right? So this is interesting because now you can actually, so what you can think of this, that the browser is going to render first all of the non-positioning elements first, right? And then it's going to render all of that positioning elements to that. So this is why we are looking into this, all right? And finally, it's important to note that relative positioning can be applied to both block and inline element, and this allows to notch inline elements in a way that isn't really possible other way, right? So now that this is what Josh described here, I really want to know if that is true, but by looking at the CSS the CSS spec here, right? So particularly is, let me do something more quickly. I want to look at the positioning layout model. That's right, here, all right. And read about this because I do want to get myself familiar with the MDN docs and the spec as well. So the CSS positioning layer model defines a coordinated base positioning of offset schemes available in CSS and the properties used to position and stack elements on the web. The model is best known for defining the basic positioning methods, including relative positioning, sticky, those that I mentioned. So relative, sticky, absolute, and fixed. It also defines how positioning elements are painted and layered, right? Think of it like a cake, right? So how you're gonna paint this on top of all of these different layers that you can apply to that. Clarifying stacking behaviors. So not only is that what are the possible positioning layouts, modes that we can have, but how their painting and layering happens, as well as how this is stacking, how the stacking behave, right? And visual order. So deep positioning layout models define the physical, logical, and shorthanded inset properties. Okay? Define the physical, logical, and shorthand inset property. The logical properties enables developing with internationalizations and responsive in mind. This is interesting. Okay. Defines the physical, logical, and shorthand inset properties. Like all CSS model, this model is impacted by other models. This model describes how positioning interact with other layouts models, such as the CSS Flex box, the CSS grids, and the CSS grids. Other models, such as CSS Anchor Position, build upon this model to enable positioning elements relative to other elements and layers. So it's interesting because now the positioning layout mode defines physical and logical and shorthand inset property. So this is the property that we can have access when we up into the positioning layout. All right. Now the selector. All right. And the glossary terms and definition. Block direction, containing block, flow relative values, inline directions. Again, block and inline direction is how the content is going to be read. Inline, the way how you read the content, and the block, how you stack that content. Containing block, flow relative values, inset, positioning context. I think that I'm well aware of this, the positioning context. The relative positioning, okay, positioning context, relative position, stacking context, stacking positions, and top layer. So there's a couple things going on here. This is why first it's important to understand what the block and the inline direction is at the end of the day. We know what is that. What is the containing block? Something I'm going to mention later. The flow relative values are something interesting. The flow relative values, okay, all right, are directional keywords value related to elements block and inline access. Okay, so how now these elements, what is the flow of these elements? So you can change the flows of this, and all of these elements normally are sorted, right? Interesting. And a good example for this is like, hey, I want to now start from the block. Block start means that, hey, I'm gonna start from here, and all of this different content that stop on that. When you have the blocking, is that at the end of how we now stacking content, right? And the inline is that, hey, this is I want to put now this element at the beginning of reading the content, whether it's in Western cultures from left to right, or in the Arab world from right to left, or in hand-based characters, right? So from top to down. It makes a lot of sense. This is why they call now physical properties and logical properties. So physical properties define position based on a physical direction, which is historically when the browser render all of these elements, it start from the 0, 0, right? From this origin here. But now the logical properties here is based on how the documents, on the other hand, define style based on the document's writing mode. And again, it all goes back to the physical work, you know? So this document writing mode or reading mode is that, hey, something that I mentioned. So in the Western cultures, we write from left to right. So the Farsi language or on the Middle East, The right is from left to right, kind of weird from Western cultures. And on China and on Asia, right? Like Trump says, like China, 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 from top down, right? This is known as the logical property, sir. And okay, makes a lot of sense. Interesting. Good, 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 good. So now that I know the flow relative value, the inline direction, I already know what is this. The inset properties, okay. The inset properties controls positioning elements' location by specifying offset from the element's default positions, and they are physical, logical, and shorthand inset property. But this is defining is the location of this specific or the specifying offsets from the element's default position, right? That makes a ton of sense. Exactly, the location of these elements, and then you have now the inset properties, which is kind of like the same, like inline. No, I mean is inset property. That's right. And then you have now two things known as the context, positioning context, right? Like this. Which element is in the containing element of an absolute positioning element, and this is very much depending of the position property value of the ancestor of the positioning element, right? Sorry about that, the noise, right? Sorry. Okay, we're back. So yeah, positioning context. Let me see if this is describing that. Yep, this the positioning context actually is inside of the absolute position, right? And the same for introducing the C index, right? And now we look at the fixed position. Okay, so we have now the positioning context, the relative position. That's interesting. Where does it lead me? The relative position. But this okay. Position CSS property. The relative position, right? The relative position. Where it was relative positioning, right? Relative positioning elements are offsets of a given amount. From the normal position within the document here, and then is the relative positioning, static positioning, right? And stacking context and the top layer, right? So again, with this, I do want to get myself familiar with this, understanding the C index, stacking with other C index, stacking floating elements using C index, stacking context, and learn positioning. So let me take a look at the spec here and how they define this. So that's interesting. The web consortium. It is maintained by people at Apple and Google, right? So this model contains defines coordinate-based positioning of offsetting scheme of CSS relative positioning, sticky, absolute, and fixed. It also defines the painting rendering model of CSS. A couple questions here. How this actually now renders? CSS is a language for describing the rendering of a structured document, such as HTML and XML, on screen, on paper, and etc. Right? A status of this document. This is a public copy of editorial draft. So, but again, by making myself familiar with this is is just to look at that, right? Introduction. This is the early Delta spec over, but this is on draft 2020. This is okay, 25 December 2025. That's interesting. The CSS repositioning. If I look back to this, the Model 3, all right, that's interesting. You have now the CSS positioning layout, Model 3 and Model, okay, Model Level 4 and Model Level 3, right? That's interesting. That's interesting. That's interesting. So in the Model 3, it's describing is things like relative, sticky, absolute, and fixed, all right, as well as the notion of the out of the flow context and the containing block. These positioning schemes controlled by positions, right, and the model interactions here. Okay. So containing block, positioning, absolute relationship between display, position, and floats. That's right. And choosing a positioning scheme, positioning property. Okay, and the possible values that it can have. Static, relative, absolute, fixed, and sticky and fixed. Got it. The initial is on the statics. It applies to all elements except table columns. Group and table columns. Inherit no. Percentage is this, no percentage. Computed value is that. Canonical order and animation type is discrete, right? And all the possible values that we can have here. All right, makes sense. Okay. Exactly. Choosing a positioning here, containing blocks and positioning boxes. Further adjustment and painting order and the stacking context. Okay. The C-index property applies to all positioning boxes when C-index is outer. So when you define that, you are telling the browser, hey, whatever positioning mode we are up into, now this is I'm gonna promote this to a stacking context. Right? Fixed and sticky positions nonetheless form a stacking context. Relative and absolute positioning boxes do not form a stacking context, but are painted as if those elements generated a new stacking context. And this is this notion of this stacking context, except that their position descendants and any will be child stacking context take part in the current stacking context. The root elements always form a stacking context regardless. What is the root element? Oh, the HTML elements always forms a the HTML elements always form a stacking context, bro. Read the docs, bro. Read the docs. Read the French toast docs, bro. Oh, they have painting order. Okay. And now we are here. Positioning coordinates. Box insets. Inset shorthand. Exactly. Box inset. The precise location of a positioning box is controlled by inset properties. The physical inset property, the flow relative inset property, and the shorthands, inset block, inset inline, or inset. The interpretation of this inset property varies by positioning scheme. Because inset property is for absolute positioning, it represents for a containing block. For relative, they represent inset to the box origin margin edge. And for sticky position, they represent inset from the scroll pore edge. Relative position, sticky position, absolute position, and there you go. Absolute position layout mode not only takes a box out of the flow, but also it layouts its containing block after the final size of the containing block has been determined according to the absolute position and layout model. First, its inset containing block is calculated because the absolute position box does not affect the size of its containing block, and its available space is always definite. Next, its width and height are resolved against the definite available space, as it is preferred size capped by the maximum size, if any, floored by the minimum size. Automatic size of the absolute position in boxes. Percentage, however, are resolved against the absolute position containing block size. Then the values of any auto margins are calculated. And lastly, its margin box is aligned within the inset containing block and self-alignment position boxes here. You also have the automatic size of absolute positioning boxes, automatic size of absolute positioning boxing of an absolute positioning box is resolved against the inset modified containing block as follows. If self-alignment property, if relevant axis stretches is, and this is the automatic size of an absolute positioning box. The auto margin, automatic size of absolute positioning. Okay, that's interesting. Okay, what is the dimension of this box in absolute? What is the margins when you are in absolute position? What is the self-aligns and the fragments? All absolute model positioning layer. The constraints that determine the use of these elements, like this. Okay. And the informative comparison of normal floats and positioning here. Okay. The acknowledge, conformance, and index and reference, and there you got it. Okay, so I think that'll be all for today's video. Yeah. Take care. Bye bye.